Those of us who come from different traditions have different thoughts on whether or not baptism is a thing that you should do as a grown-up when you're able to decide for yourself. And in the Church of England, we don't. We save that for confirmation, a thing we say, I'd like to own this. But I think that passage is one of those few that speak clearly to God's wish that everybody of whatever age is part of the family of God. That you don't have to wait till you understand it all, because if you had to wait until you understood it all before you called yourself a Christian, I still wouldn't be able to get baptized, right? You don't have to understand it all. So Amelia is already part of God's family, and we've signified that somehow in baptism, and God has done something in that act. And we don't have to understand it, we just have to welcome the little ones, the babies, as that particular translation had. So, if you have questions about that, write them down and put them in our box at the back. It's a big white box, says ask me anything on it. But we have other questions that people have already asked that we're going to explore today. So, if you're not used to this will be interesting. If you've got a question, I will want to know what it is. Like as a follow-up, put your hand up, somebody get the microphone, and we'll hear from you. So that's the plan. What was your name?
Reggie.
Reggie, can you put this in front of anybody who needs it? Right? You don't have to answer any questions, but I can't wander around with it and answer the question. So sit there, and when somebody puts their hand up, I'll point you. Between us, we'll make sure everybody gets heard. Got it? Bless you. It's a surprisingly important role, Reggie. Okay. So, good. And I sit down for this bit because otherwise I get carried away. So it keeps me in one place, and Toby can point the camera at me. So questions. I've got questions. Great questions. The first one came from Val a couple of weeks ago. You might be aware that we've got a new Bible. We replaced our Bible because the old one was 44 years old. But Val said, why do we need to keep updating the Bible? She's thinking they're not changing the Bible, are they? Why do we need to get a new Bible? Why do they update it? So, the rule is that I am not the only person who's ever thought a thought and knows a thing in this church. You get to answer the questions first. Why do we keep updating the Bible? Why did we do that? Somebody other than me must have a thought, otherwise I will just hog the floor. Who's got a thought? Amelia's got her hand up. That is promising. Why do we keep getting new Bibles every now and then in a church? Any thoughts? You must have some thoughts. Mike's got a thought. Go on.
Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Oh. I think is it to reflect, to help translate to the times. The King James version was written to sound very eloquent and reflect perhaps what King James wanted the Bible to sound like, but it wasn't actually from the original translation. So that was done for perhaps not the greatest of reasons. But then you have examples like modern translations like The Message, which is done to help communicate with younger generation or people who might not be familiar with it.
Okay, I like that. So there's a philosophy behind a translation. The King James version was done to reflect his particular theology, perhaps, although they did do good work. The King James was a treat. We think it was old-fashioned, but when they put it in, people had only heard the Bible in Latin before then. So that was suddenly to get it in your own language was a wonderfully inclusive thing, but he had his own agenda. Maybe we need another agenda sometimes, and The Message, if you don't know it, is a wonderful interpretation of the Bible that can make it much clearer. I like that. Any other thoughts on why we might have to update and change the Bible before I launch it? I think you've hit an awful lot of it there. It's true. I'll hear from 47. Easy job for you so far.
Because newer manuscripts have been found through the centuries which have been more accurate than the older manuscripts that existed. So that's another reason.
There you go. And I think we've covered it. Those are the two great reasons. We keep getting better bits of the Bible. It's not that we're changing it. It's just that we're getting closer and closer back in time to fragments that were more original, so we can see what was actually written, and we can perhaps change how we understand it. Who here speaks excellent Greek and Hebrew? None of us, right? Not even me. Somebody at the first service did. I don't. We need to remember that any time it's translated, somebody's made a choice, and the words that we use in English that reflect that will change over time. The King James said, used to talk about Jesus coming to judge the quick and the dead, which we associate with Westerns now, but that meant people who were alive. We don't say people who are quick because they're alive now. So we need to change the word so they are like what we use now. One of the reasons we've got this one, the NRSV, Two reasons. I like that this says people instead of men when it's talking to general everybody. Like old versions used to say men, and women just have to assume, okay, no, that means me too. And I think that's just nonsense that the patriarchy was doing that to you. And also, this is the same Bible as the Church of England. So we're in line with the rest of people. If you download any Church of England stuff, this will be an NRSV. If you want to think about whether your Bible should be the same as ours, have a word with me. I'll tell you what it is. What's the best version of the Bible to use if you're studying the Bible? Any thoughts? What's the best translation of that? A trick question, all of them. If you're trying to study the Bible, if you've got to write a sermon, and I hope that some of you at some point will have to write a sermon and come and do this, then if you read one English translation, then you're just having to buy somebody's choices. If you read several, you'll get to think, oh, what was really going on behind the text? Always worth looking at, and they're all online or on your phone. Good answers, thank you very much. You covered that. All right. Tricky one, so bear with me, and this is... so somebody wrote this, who's here. I, like many others, find it difficult to come to terms with the fact that our religion is based on such a bellicose nation as Israel. I like that, bonus points, bellicose, meaning warlike. Leaving aside all we read of wars in the Old Testament, I personally had a relative blown up in Jerusalem during service there just after World War II. And yesterday's horrors of hospital attacks in Gaza were beyond what I can see a God-loving nation would perpetrate. Am I becoming a New Testament Christian? Great question. What do we do with Israel's history, and being a New Testament Christian? Really appreciated that one. So I think there's quite a lot to say about that. Any thoughts from anyone else? Anybody got similar thoughts, questions, or feelings before I try and unpack some of that? It's a complicated topic. David's got something to add. Keep it brief, David, but I always like to hear from you.
Well, in relation to all these things that are happening in the world now, it comes back to evil men.
Evil men.
And that goes through the Bible.
It's interesting, isn't it? Consistently men, not women. Very few women perpetrating acts of violence at the moment. No. Okay, so there's a lot of it, and there's a patriarchy thing. Anybody got any answers, solutions, thoughts to chip in? Yes, Joe does at the back. That way. Find your way across to him there. Pass the microphone along.
You're talking about a warlike country, but for a long time, England was considered the most Christian country in the world, and didn't we have the British Empire?
Yes.
And that was kind of messed up.
Okay, so we need to, when we look at a nation of faith such as Israel and wonder what they're doing and their warlike actions, which I'm going to unpack in a moment, we need to remember, of course, that for a long time we were, and the Church of England owned slaves, right? That we were part of all sorts of warlike actions before and after conflicts around the world. So it's not unusual, and there have been any number of crusades done in the name of religion. So I guess some things to unpack in this question. Great question, and thank you very much. The first thing we have to do is remember that ancient Israel in the Bible is not the same thing as current Israel now. Two completely different things. They happen to be in roughly the same place, but you can't confuse the one with the other. What do you do with all the war in the Bible is a whole other sermon series, and we've touched on it in the past, and I'll try and find some links back to previous sermons where we've addressed it, and I'll put those in the footnotes underneath here. But if you've been coming along to our Lent course, you'll have heard the guy leading that for us use the term Christological hermeneutic. Bonus points for that. And the hermeneutic is the lens you interpret the Bible through. You look at the Bible and go, what on earth does that mean? And you need like a plan. And you can have a feminist hermeneutic or a liberation hermeneutic. But a Christological hermeneutic is one where you think, okay, if I want to understand God, I look at Jesus. Jesus is what God looks like when God turns up and can definitely be pinned down and identified. And Jesus was not violent. Jesus rejected violence, and when violence was done to him, did not respond with violence. He has some things to say about peace, right? So when we look at violence in the Old Testament, somehow that jars. And I think we need to live with that tension and say, somehow that isn't godlike, even though God's faithful people were writing about it and felt called to do that. And it's just hard. And I think spiritual maturity, the same as regular maturity, is learning to think and feel two different things at the same time. So just accepting that it's complicated and going, I don't know, and keep praying about it. But when God turns up and looks like a human being and is a human being, he is peaceful and not warlike. That helps me. What do we do with Israel's wars at the moment? Some stories from a friend of mine who's a bishop now. Just before she was consecrated a bishop, she got a tour of the Holy Land, and it was before the current conflict had started. But she went and visited lots of Palestinian people and was just horrified at the conditions they were forced to live in, and was aching with compassion, and clearly they are being mistreated, and that's not good. And they didn't ask for the state of Israel to be put there, and she had nothing but sympathy for them. I think, okay, well, clearly she knew what she thought. And then she went and sat with some Jewish people who'd been living there, and they were still like 2 generations on from people whose parents were killed in Europe in the Second World War. You haven't got to read very much history to know that the Jewish people have needed a place to go and be safe that was their own, because they have not had that. Every few hundred years, they are thrown out of whatever country they are in, and you never quite feel safe. So the idea that the world got together and said, you can have Israel, this place will be yours, you can defend it and look after it and feel safe here, also makes sense. And then how those two things get to play out with each other is complicated. But so that's my summary. We can't confuse modern Israel and current Israel. The two sides there clearly have a lot of legitimate cause for their feelings. Violence is never a good thing, and we're called to pray for everybody on both sides and for leaders. The last part of your question was, am I becoming a New Testament Christian? And I hope so, but not at the expense of not being an Old Testament Christian. Then we have to read the Old Testament. It is what forms us. Jesus was a faithful Jew who loved and knew the Old Testament and preached from it, and we see the same God at work there, but we interpret it in the light of Christ that we see more clearly in the New Testament. I think that's as many things as I can say about that, but I'll try and put some links to other sermons. Any follow-up? It's complicated. I would hate for there to be any pushback after any of this. There's been too much anti-Semitism in the church, and we need to keep dismantling that. Have I missed something? Am I going to be kicking myself? Okay. When you're stuck and you're reading the papers, as I hope that you do, pray for everybody, that decisions are made with compassion. Okay. We'll have one more if we've got time. Are there any other questions from anyone else after what we've been through, what we've seen, questions about baptism, anything like that? And then we'll send Amelia off, send somebody off to get the kids back, because we'll need Olivia. Any other? Or I'll take this one. Got a shy bunch today. Okay. Well, we had a couple of sermons recently on the atonement and the nature of salvation and things like that. So somebody's asked this. If sin is inherited and passed down, if we're born into sin, why isn't salvation passed down? Great question, right? So we've been talking about that. Deeply geeky Christian question. I like that. So these were my thoughts on this question. What is sin? Are we born into sin? Can you inherit sin? Do your parents sin? Does that get passed on to children? I don't think it does, but I think we kind of are born into a sinful world, but we need to think about what sin is. It's a big word. We've been thinking a lot this last year about a definition of sin from Elizabeth Oldfield. She talks about being fully alive as this calling of all of us to be connected with God, with each other, and with ourselves. And sin is anything that is getting in the way of that is stop you being with God, or relating to your friends, or being in touch with yourself. So what then is that sort of thing? Someone I was reading this week was talking about sin being things that we do. Sometimes you do stuff that you know you shouldn't, that will get in the way of loving yourself, of loving your neighbour, or of loving God. And even if you're not a Christian, that makes sense. To know that there's stuff you do that makes it harder for you to love yourself and to love your friends. The second type of sin is things people do to you that makes it harder for you to love yourself, love people. You know, if John was to swing by and say, listen, new vicar, you're getting this all wrong, and give me a telling off, that would be awful, right? John would never do that. He's the perfect example of how older vicars should behave. But if he did, I would feel cross with him and not be able to get on with him well. And he might not want to come back and visit so often. I might not be able to pray because I'd be too busy worrying about it. And I'd be feeling sad and not able to love myself. John's things have been sin in my life. So sometimes what we do affects other people, which is why we're called into this cycle of forgiveness in the Lord's Prayer that we'll pray later. We're called to forgive ourselves and each other as we know that God does. But the third thing is that there is just sin in the world. There are structures of international rules and finance and things that keep people down, that make it harder to do well if you're not, this guy's the white privileged male vicar of Calverley. I have an awful lot of privilege, and if you're not all of those things, it's harder. If you haven't got a lot of money, it's harder to get more money. There are things in this world that make it harder for us to exist with justice, and that's sin as well. So I don't think all of that stuff can't really be inherited. So I think from the question, I'm rejecting the idea that we inherit sin, but we are kind of born into it. How are we saved? We talked about this 2 weeks ago, so a sermon worth going back and having a look at, I think. Salvation is not this idea that one of us with a dog collar on stands at the front, says, you better believe in Jesus. You go, okay, I will, and then magically you're now a Christian, saved, and you don't need to worry about it and can go to heaven when you die. That is not salvation. That is thin and pointless. What we're saved into as Christians is a journey of flourishing, of being fully alive, of being connected with God and ourselves and each other, and discovering what God wants us to do in the world. And even if you don't have a grand specific calling, Mother Teresa used to say, we're all called to do small things with great love, and we get better at that. And we have to do this work of discipleship, while God does this work of sanctification, of helping us to be better, of bringing us alive and improving our character. And that takes a lifetime. It's a million choices. So that sort of salvation can't be handed down. You might inherit a nice wardrobe from your parents or some money or a house, but you can't give Amelia a lifetime of good character. She's going to have to work that out for herself, right? All you can do is give her the tools to help grow it. And that's what we get from God. Not instant salvation, but the pleasure of having stepped into salvation, working it out in fear and trembling. So that's, I think, why we can't suddenly be saved against a sin that we're born into. Any pushback? Any questions? Have you had enough? Good. I'm going to leave it there. We're going to send somebody out to get Olivia and the kids. There were questions about how we're using Kids Corner. There was another one about God being all-knowing, and we'll roll those over to the next time. But we love to do this. At least once a term we do this. If you've got questions, write them down, and we'll always let you know when we're doing it so you can come back and hear them. No question is too difficult. Brilliant.